Most Americans assume that when a law changes, it happens the same way it always has. There's a debate, there's a vote, there's public disagreement. You hear about it on the news. You see politicians argue on television, and eventually, Congress decides. But what if that assumption is no longer true? What if one of the most divisive issues in American history could be reshaped without a single vote, without a single debate, and without the public ever being asked? That question isn't theoretical anymore. It's real, and it's happening right now. In recent months, something subtle but important has been unfolding in Washington. There hasn't been a major gun control bill passed by Congress. There hasn't been a sweeping national debate on the House floor. And yet, changes are happening. Policies are shifting. Rules are being reinterpreted. Agencies are expanding their reach. And it's all happening through executive power. That raises a serious question every American should be asking, regardless of where they stand on guns. If lawmakers can't get the votes, does executive authority become the workaround? To understand why this matters so much, we have to start with how the system is supposed to work. The Constitution places the power to make laws in the hands of Congress. That's not an accident. The founders believed that laws affecting the people should require debate, compromise, and accountability. Representatives would have to stand behind their votes. Senators would have to answer to their states. The process was intentionally slow, messy, and difficult because liberty demands friction. When laws are easy to pass, freedoms are easy to lose. Executive power, on the other hand, was meant to be limited. The president executes the law. That's the job. Not to create new laws, not to bypass Congress, but to carry out what the legislature has already passed. Executive orders were originally intended to manage the internal operations of the federal government. They were not designed to replace legislation. Yet over time, presidents of both parties have stretched that power further and further, especially when Congress refuses to cooperate. Gun control has become one of the clearest examples of this shift. When sweeping gun legislation stalls in Congress, attention turns elsewhere. Federal agencies, regulatory interpretations, executive actions. Instead of passing new laws, existing laws are redefined. Old statutes are interpreted in new ways. Bureaucratic rulemaking becomes the tool of choice, and the public often doesn't notice until the consequences are already in effect. This is where things get uncomfortable, because whether you support gun control or oppose it, bypassing the legislative process should concern you. If one administration can use executive power to restrict a constitutional right, another administration can use the same power to expand or restrict something else. The precedent matters. The method matters. And history shows that once power shifts away from elected lawmakers and toward executive agencies, it rarely shifts back. Supporters of these actions often argue that executive measures are necessary because Congress is broken or gridlocked. They say the system doesn't work anymore. But that gridlock is not a flaw. It's a feature. It exists to prevent radical, sweeping changes from being imposed on a divided nation without consensus. When half the country strongly disagrees, the answer is not to rule by executive pen. The answer is persuasion, debate, and yes, compromise. What we're seeing instead is a growing reliance on regulatory power. Agencies tasked with enforcement begin making decisions that look a lot like lawmaking. Definitions change. Classifications shift. Enforcement priorities are rewritten. Suddenly, activities that were legal yesterday fall into gray areas today, not because Congress voted, but because an agency decided to interpret the law differently. This creates a dangerous level of uncertainty for ordinary Americans. Laws are supposed to be clear. You're supposed to know what's legal and what isn't. When rules change quietly through executive action, people can find themselves in violation of regulations they never knew existed. That's not how a free society is supposed to operate. Laws should not be hidden in regulatory fine print or announced through obscure agency notices. There's also the issue of accountability. When Congress passes a law, voters know who to hold responsible. Representatives can be voted out. Senators can lose re-election. But when policy comes from executive agencies, responsibility becomes blurred. Who do you blame? The president? The agency director? The unelected bureaucrat who drafted the rule? That lack of accountability is one of the biggest dangers of governing through executive power. Historically, Americans have been deeply suspicious of centralized authority. That suspicion is baked into the Constitution itself. The separation of powers exists because the founders understood something timeless. Power concentrates unless it is actively restrained. They feared rule by decree. They feared executive overreach. And they believed that the people's rights were safest when power was divided, slow-moving, and transparent. The Second Amendment sits right at the center of this debate, not because of modern politics, but because of what it represents. It's not just about firearms. It's about limits on government power. It's about the relationship between the state and the citizen. Whether someone owns a gun or not, the amendment stands as a reminder that rights are not permissions granted by government. They are protections against it. That's why executive action in this area is especially controversial. When policies affecting a constitutional right are enacted without legislative approval, it raises alarms. Not because change is inherently wrong, but because the process bypasses the safeguards meant to protect liberty. If the government can reinterpret rights through regulation, then rights become conditional. And conditional rights are not rights at all. Some argue that executive actions are temporary and can be undone by the next administration. But that argument ignores reality. Temporary rules often become permanent. Once agencies expand their authority, they defend it aggressively. Court challenges take years. In the meantime, people live under the new reality. Businesses adapt. Citizens comply. And over time, what began as a temporary measure becomes the new normal. There's also a cultural cost. When major policies are enacted without debate, public trust erodes. People feel shut out of the process. They feel governed, not represented. That frustration doesn't disappear. It builds. And history shows that when people lose faith in institutions, polarization increases, not decreases. Executive power may feel efficient, but it often deepens division rather than resolving it. This isn't just about gun control. It's about how America is governed. It's about whether laws still come from the people through their representatives, or whether they increasingly come from executive offices and federal agencies. Today, it may be firearms. Tomorrow, it could be speech, privacy, or property rights. The mechanism is the same, even if the issue changes. Defenders of executive action often frame opposition as fear-mongering, but skepticism of power is not fear. It's responsibility. A free people are supposed to question authority, especially when that authority expands beyond its original limits. Blind trust in government has never preserved liberty. Informed skepticism has. The uncomfortable truth is that executive power grows most rapidly when the public is distracted. When people are focused on headlines, scandals, and outrage cycles, structural changes happen quietly. Regulations are rewritten. Enforcement standards shift. And by the time most people notice, reversing course becomes extremely difficult. That's why awareness matters. You don't have to agree on policy to agree on process. You don't have to be pro-gun or anti-gun to recognize that bypassing Congress sets a precedent that affects everyone. Once the legislative branch is sidelined, democracy weakens. And when democracy weakens, individual rights are always the first thing at risk. The founders understood something that modern politics often forgets. Power must be restrained not because leaders are evil, but because they are human. Ambition, fear, and ideology don't disappear when someone takes office. The system was designed to protect the people from the worst impulses of all factions, including those who believe they're acting for the greater good. If gun control measures truly have broad public support, they should survive debate. They should withstand scrutiny. They should pass through Congress openly. If they cannot, that fact itself is meaningful. It suggests the country is divided, and division demands caution, not executive shortcuts. The question Americans should be asking right now isn't just, do I support this policy? It's, do I support how this policy is being implemented? Because the method will outlast the moment. Administrations change. Power structures remain. And what is normalized today will be used tomorrow by someone else, possibly for reasons you strongly oppose. History doesn't look kindly on governments that rule by decree. Even when intentions are good, the erosion of democratic processes always leads to unintended consequences. Liberty is rarely lost overnight. It's lost gradually, through exceptions, emergencies, and justifications that seem reasonable at the time. So when you hear talk of gun control through executive power, pay attention. Not just to what is being proposed, but to how it's being done. Ask why debate is being avoided. Ask why votes aren't happening. Ask who benefits from removing transparency and accountability from the process. Because once laws no longer require consent, freedom becomes fragile. And once people accept governance without representation, reclaiming it becomes far more difficult than defending it in the first place. This moment matters, not because of one policy, one administration, or one issue. It matters because it reflects a broader shift in how power is exercised in America. And the direction of that shift will shape the future long after today's headlines fade. Stay informed, question authority, and remember that rights protected by process are far stronger than rights reshaped by executive power alone.